Thus far, in our treatment of the period known as the Scientific Revolution, we've looked largely at developments in physics, astronomy, and cosmology. And there's good reason to do so because those fields developed significantly in the period. But we shouldn't neglect what's going on in other fields of natural philosophy. So this lecture, we're going to leave the physical universe behind for a few minutes and look instead at the biological world. We're going to look at natural history, the study of the biological universe. We're also going to take this opportunity to look at some further ways of organizing and developing knowledge about the natural world, which is in contrast to the predominantly mathematical perspectives that Galileo and his followers employed. Well, the major source for natural history throughout the Middle Ages was, of course, Pliny, that encyclopedic Roman writer who wrote popularizations of Greek texts for a leisured Roman society. Pliny survived through the Middle Ages and was widely available. Well, just as Aristotle and Ptolemy are criticized in the Scientific Revolution and in the Renaissance, so too does Pliny come in for some rather hard-hitting criticism. In the 1490s, several accounts of the errors, the mistakes of Pliny appear. The two most important are as long as Pliny himself is. One of them goes article by article through Pliny to show the errors. One written by Ermolao Barbaro and the other by Niccolo Leoniceno. But there's something interesting about the way they identify Pliny's errors. You might think that they would go out in the natural world or collect more observations to show, well, Pliny said so-and-so, I saw something different, clearly Pliny is wrong. No, what they do is they say Pliny didn't read his Greek sources right. And so Pliny gets criticized by reference to earlier sources, Dioscorides, Aristotle, Theophrastus. Clearly, we're back in the realm of humanist-type critiques that use texts to criticize texts. But of course, that's not where it ended. Throughout the Scientific Revolution, there is a great deal more observation of the natural world, and in fact, the natural world gets larger, in the sense that at the same time these critiques of Pliny are coming out in the 1490s, the horizons of Europeans are being massively expanded by the voyages to Asia, Africa, and the discovery of the Americas. Well, there are some problems that exist with the classical texts. Often they did not depict plants in an easily recognizable fashion. You couldn't take one of these texts and go out in your garden and identify things. This is a particular problem when you consider that most people who are trying to identify plants are doing so for medicinal purposes. So you need to know how to identify plants. Moreover, the classical sources were all written in the Mediterranean. So even common plants that occur only north of the Alps don't occur in them. This means that new herbals had to be written even before any plants came back into Europe from far-off lands. One of the most important herbals is that of Leonard Fuchs, which is published in 1542, so the year just before Copernicus's De Revolutionibus. And the 1540s, 1550s sees the appearance of quite a number of new herbals. Fuchs's herbals is profusely illustrated, and the illustrations are more accurate. They're drawn from life rather than copied from earlier sources. The same is true of animals. One of the most important works is a 5-volume history of animals. The publication starts in 1551. The last volume doesn't come out until 1621, written by the Swiss Conrad Gesner. And one I should mention, largely for its humorous value, is a work devoted to the insects, published in 1634 by Thomas Moffat. And yes, little Miss Moffat, who sat on her tuffet, is in fact a relative. So the spider and the insect that the insects that Thomas Moffat wrote about are in fact related. Well, from 1500 to 1700 and even beyond, even down to our own day, there was an explosion in the number of plants and animals recognized. Things from the New World, things from Asia, things from north of the Alps. Information on the New World and Asia flooded in from explorers, travelers, merchants, missionaries, settled colonists, Jesuits, Franciscans, and so forth. I'll mention just a couple of these characters. One important person is the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, who lived in Mexico. In 1585, he writes a 5-volume history of New Spain, interestingly enough, writing it in both Spanish and the native Aztec language. And also the Jesuit José de Acosta, who went to Peru in 1570, studied the natural history of the Indies, South America, the New World, which he publishes in 1590, and his publication garners him the name of the Pliny of the New World, which I'm sure the people that gave it to him meant that as a compliment. New food crops come to Europe. For example, corn. Corn is first described by Fuchs. It's illustrated in 1542, even though Fuchs is slightly confused. He seems to think that it comes from Turkey rather than from the New World. In fact, to this day, in Italian, the word for corn is gran turco, the Turkish grain. There's the sweet potato and the potato, which are first illustrated in 1597 in the Englishman John Gerard's Herbal, as well as tomato and tobacco. And people are not certain about tobacco. Some people think it's the greatest thing that's ever been discovered. James I of England called it a noxious weed. Besides food crops, there's a lot of hope that some of these newly discovered plants would cure previously incurable diseases. One example of this is so-called Jesuit's bark, or Peruvian bark, which is the bark of the cinchona tree. It's where we get quinine from. Well, it was discovered that this was an anti-malarial. The Spanish settlers learned this from the local peoples in South America. And it was brought back to Europe and used in great quantity throughout the 17th century as an anti-malarial, as a cure against fevers. So when you mix tonic water with your gin to have a drink, what that actually is, it's quinine in the water. It's an anti-malarial, sort of a leftover medicinal substance. Curiously enough, the new plants from the New World were incorporated into herbals very, very slowly, and perhaps we need to explain this. One of the simplest explanations for this is, in fact, that the Spanish writers who wrote huge volumes, 5, 10, 15, 20-volume manuscripts on cataloging New World plants and animals, generally did not have these things published. They stayed in manuscript. They went back to Spain. In Spain, they were considered proprietary information, state information, and so they were never published. Many of these texts have, in fact, only been rediscovered in the 20th century, or 19th or 20th century, and been published relatively recently. So the information really didn't get out from the Spanish Empire to the rest of Europe about all these interesting plants and animals that these Franciscans and Jesuits and other people were studying in the New World throughout the 16th century. Well, the ancients left several models of how to deal with natural historical information. We can list 3 important ones. There's Pliny, who is a descriptive writer with an interest in moralizing. He tends to draw morals from the life of animals. He tries to be entertaining. There's Aristotle and Theophrastus, who write on animals and plants, respectively, and they try to find out their causes, that is, the Aristotelian causes, why they are the way they are, what they're for. So that's another method. Dioscorides, the Greek writer, is a medical writer, and so he describes plants with a view towards their medical utility. And now all 3 of these models were used in the 16th and 17th century to digest the new material. But one problem is, if you think about what's happening with all this information, there's a sense of information overload that begins to happen when we're trying to put together so much natural historical information. How do you classify it? How do you put it together? How do you retrieve it? We can think of it in very modern terms of information overload and data retrieval problems. And they were experiencing this in the 16th and 17th century. But when we talk about this information, I have to take time to point out a very interesting change that happens in the 17th century with biological, botanical, zoological information. There's an important change about how it's treated. And to really understand the background to it, we need to go back to the Middle Ages for a moment. The Middle Ages used Pliny as the model. There are some early medieval writers like St. Isidore of Seville that expand on Pliny. There are medieval bestiaries and herbals that use information out of Pliny and add to it things from folklore, real and fabulous animals, these kind of things. So they tended to view flora and fauna not just in a descriptive sense, but they would associate with it all kinds of folkloric beliefs, uses in the Bible, symbolism of plants and animals, kinds of things that were important to Pliny, but also important to Christian writers, using the natural world as emblematic of theological truths. Now, you have to ask the question, and I'm not going to even try to answer it today, but when you see animals like deer and squirrels and mice, whatever animal you want to think of, alongside things like dragons, phoenixes, and basilisks, did the medievals really think that somewhere on Earth were phoenixes, dragons, and basilisks? Or were they just describing animals in the sense of what they could mean? That is to say, the phoenix is as an emblem of resurrection, an important Christian tenet. So we need to think about how the medievals viewed their natural world. It wasn't just descriptive, it was also associative. This becomes even stronger in the Renaissance with the humanist movement that rediscovers all these classical sources. So as the Renaissance moves on, descriptions of animals in natural histories and descriptions of plants get longer and longer and longer and longer because they are associated not only with biblical citations, the Psalms mention lots of plants and animals, for example, but also with ancient authorities, natural philosophical writers like Dioscorides, Aristotle, Pliny, Theophrastus, but also with classical literature like Ovid, and also with folklore elements, all kinds of things. So these flora and fauna become not just things, but emblems. This perspective has been called an emblematic worldview, and it's clearly visible, for example, in medieval art and Renaissance art, and various other places. Let me give you a few examples of it. We could perhaps go out in any empty lot and find this plant. This is the plantain. It's found often at the feet of characters in Renaissance art, because if you look for the plantain, the best place to look for it is in a well-trodden path. It can grow in very hard-packed soil very easily. It comes to represent the path of the Christian life, the way of Christ, the way on which so many people have trod. And so at the feet of saints, for example, or biblical figures in Renaissance art, you often see a plantain. Other examples from plants. How can we talk about the mulberry tree, for example, without linking it to the story of Pyramus and Thisbe out of Ovid's Metamorphoses, who say why it turned from white into red? Well, Pyramus and Thisbe is the classical Romeo and Juliet, and when the male member of the pair kills himself, his blood is soaked up by the mulberry tree, and the mulberries turn from white to red. Or the peacock. Can you talk about the peacock without mentioning its pride? Can you talk about the peacock without mentioning that it's a bird related to the goddess Juno in classical literature? Or the interesting fact mentioned by Pliny that it's ashamed of its feet, which you can tell because it puts its tail up, but if ever it bends its head down and sees its feet, its tail falls in shame. Okay? So the peacock is ashamed of its feet. So plants and animals aren't simply specimens, as they are in modern science. They represent a huge raft of associated ideas. Part of this viewpoint rests upon the deeply held belief that the world is full of messages that are to be read. They're not just things out there, and they're not just for human use, they're for human contemplation as well. Well, during the 17th century, this associative view vanishes and is replaced by a more literally descriptive view simply of the thing as it exists in itself. So descriptions of animals no longer talk about, let's say, the peacock and pride, but rather about its anatomy, about its description, talking about its size and its shape. It's not actually ashamed of its feet anymore. The feet are just described. Right? So the web of analogies within the natural world and its moral and symbolic connection to human life is replaced by a world of discrete and individual objects. This is a crucial and fundamental change in the way human beings think of their world. And perhaps we can relate it to a contemporaneous change that I've already talked about in terms of map making. That is, going from the TO diagrams, which show a symbolic Earth and show the relationships between things, metaphorically and symbolically, to Mercator's projection on a grid that lays out literally true descriptions, analytical views of the world. The change certainly moves us towards a more scientific way of viewing the natural world. And the change is presumably, I would imagine, related to contemporaneous developments in the way we read texts, particularly Protestant literalism in reading the Scripture over the Catholic medieval analogical, interpretive, metaphorical view of Scripture. But one should point out that it also involves the loss of some long-term developments and references within a culture that bind the culture together. The sense of a unified and meaningful cosmos changes. This is no longer now an image of the path of Christ, the path of the Christian. It's a weed that we take out of our lawns and throw away. It's a different way of looking at the world. It also changes what counts as true. Now, let me take a quick example of this. If I said to you, oh, he's a peacock, you know exactly what I mean by that. You have a sense of what that means. And if a person were to come up and say, well, wait a minute, I've seen him. I think he's a human being. We'd wonder what planet that person had landed from. Because to say he is a peacock is true. It's not literally true. It's a different kind of truth. It's a metaphorical kind of truth. And that kind of metaphorical, symbolic kind of truth gets purged out of natural history in the 17th century. Well, the natural history becomes not only a part of natural philosophy, that is botany, zoology, biological subjects, but also a new method of investigating anything in the natural world. And the person who's most closely related to this development is Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was born in 1561, lives until 1626. He's the Lord Chancellor of England and a very prolific writer. He espoused the common view of the day that all the methods and content of learning had to be reformed. In fact, he wrote a book called The New Organon, which is published in 1620, so the year the Pilgrims land in Plymouth Bay, if you want to relate those two developments. 1620, he writes The New Organon, which is supposed to replace the Organon, the old Organon, the logical works of Aristotle. The first section is called the Great Instauration. Instauration meaning building up again from the foundations, setting new foundations. He writes in this book that, quote, the entire fabric of human reason, which we employ in the investigation of nature, is badly put together. And it is built up, and like some magnificent structure, without any foundation. He then suggests that we must, quote, try the whole thing anew and commence a total reconstruction of the sciences. So he wants to pitch out everything and start over in terms of looking at the natural world. He roundly criticized scholastic methods, the methods of the universities, but he also showed very little interest in the kind of mathematical methods used by people like Kepler and Galileo. He preferred a compilation of descriptive observations of the world, which he called a natural history. There are really four features of Baconian methodology that I should mention. He wants you, one, to compile observations. Compile as many of them as you can get. Just write them down. 2, be very slow at drawing conclusions from them. Avoid drawing conclusions as long as possible. 3, avoid making great comprehensive systems, the kind of systems that Aristotle made that describe everything in the world. Don't make those, he says. And 4th, very important, use what you find. Now, this interest in utility, in useful knowledge, on Bacon's part, probably derives from a similar emphasis that we've seen in the natural magic tradition. And you'll remember when I was talking about natural magic, I started with a quote from Francis Bacon, who says that magic, the magic tradition, promises us a way of recalling natural philosophy from mere contemplation to works. He says in another place, the wisdom that we have derived principally from the Greeks is but like the boyhood of knowledge, for it has the characteristic property of boys. It can talk, but it cannot generate. For it is fruitful of controversies, but barren of works. He says that Aristotle's view was corrupted by the use of logic. Plato's view is corrupted by natural theology. And the Neoplatonist view is corrupted by mathematics. So he wants to, as he puts it, unroll the volume of creation, to linger and meditate therein, and with minds washed clean of opinions. Well, one might well ask, is that even possible? Probably not, but that's the Baconian method. Well, his view of the expansion and the exploitation of scientific knowledge is, I think, linked intellectually to his view, as Lord Chancellor of England, to the expansion of Great Britain. The empire of knowledge, the empire of Britain. Expand both. Exploit what's out there to the greater building up of both of the empires. Now, accordingly, with his emphasis on utility, Bacon favors what he calls mechanical knowledge. What does he mean by that? He means the knowledge of mechanics, literally, people involved in the trades. He says these people over in the universities, they're just disputing about nothing or about subtleties and contemplative things, whereas workmen, shipwrights, people like that are actually building something. They're actually making something. So he looks to the practical works of the trades as a source of information and of progress. People should pay attention to these tradesmen and listen to what they have to say. Now, he doesn't mean that the tradesmen do everything wonderfully and we should imitate them. In fact, he divides people into 3 groups as animals. He talks about ants, spiders, and bees. The ants are the workers. They're constantly working. They don't actually know why they're working or how they're working, but they work and they do something. They put nothing of themselves into what they do. They just collect things and build things. Then there are spiders who collect nothing but spin these airy webs out of their own substance. The ants are the tradesmen. The spiders are the people at the universities, the contemplatives. The bees, however, are the ones we want to imitate because the bees go out into the world and they collect nectar from all the flowers they can find. They digest it, and what do you get? The sweetness of honey as their product. So he wants to combine these 2 things, the contemplation and the activity. Now, a natural history for Bacon can be compiled for anything. It doesn't have to be a vegetable, an animal, or a mineral. It can be a phenomenon like heat and cold. It can be wind, magnetism, or even something like density. It's just the idea of you're going to pick a topic and collect observations about it. There's a disadvantage here, though, because you can spend years and years collecting observations on, let's say, the wind or on magnetism or whatever, but it's really hard to digest that. The more observations you have, the harder it is to make them into something coherent. How can you actually do this? If you just take observations, oftentimes you're going to get things that are contradictory because you may not notice certain crucial variables that are different in one observation versus another. So you get contradictory observations. How do you decide between them. On the other hand, the Baconian method emphasized observation and especially the making of experiments. And this is an interesting point, this issue of making experiments, because Bacon says something which is interesting and probably links him more to a government official in early modern England. He says that the secrets of nature, I'm quoting here, reveal themselves more readily under the vexations of art than when they go their own way. He speaks in another place of taking nature and putting nature on the rack in order to force her to confess her secrets. So this is a very different view of man's relationship to nature. It's not Mother Nature that we're listening to attentively as dutiful children as she explains to us her ways. No, we're going to grab her and tie her down to the rack and put the pincers on her until she confesses her secrets to us. It's a shift in ideas of mankind's view to nature, and it's not a subtle shift either. Well, the issue of experiment in the scientific revolution is a vexed one. What is an experiment? How does it differ from experience? For example, if I vex nature and force it to do something in a particular way, is the knowledge I gain from that equally valid as the knowledge that I get by just watching nature? How have I changed the system and forced it to act differently? It's a difficult question, isn't it? How does experiment differ from observation? How are we going to use experiment? How are we going to tell what an experiment is or what the conditions are? And Bacon didn't really have an answer for that. The 17th century debates that for a very long time. In fact, we're still debating that question. How much does the investigator change the investigated by the action of investigation? It's a difficult question. Well, Bacon's methodology proved to be particularly influential in the second half of the 17th century, and especially, perhaps not surprisingly, in England. And we'll come back to some of the Baconians of the latter part of the 17th century in a later lecture. Right now, I want to stop for a moment and sum up some of the things we've seen in the last 6 lectures. One of the things that I think is most important to characterize this time period is the proliferation of alternative methods of learning about the world. We've seen all kinds of different methodologies. We have late scholastic methods that are still being used at the university. Don't necessarily buy the rhetoric that's spouted out by some of the more famous figures against the university, saying that they're sterile and they're spiders and that sort of thing. The people in the universities, the scholastics, the late scholastics we see now, were not as hidebound as all that. They were trying to incorporate a lot of new knowledge as well. So scholasticism is still very much alive in this period. There are abstractive mathematical methods. We see those with Kepler and Galileo. There is the natural magic tradition emphasizing utility, looking at the interconnections between things in the world that we've seen with Agrippa and John Dee, for example. There are the empirical methods, used a great deal by, let's say, the Paracelsians, who want you to sell your books, go out into the world, examine things, taste plants, put minerals in the fire, see what you can find out by working with the natural world in an empirical way. There are methods of experimental modeling. We just saw that in the previous lecture with Gilbert, who uses the lodestone as an experimental model for the Earth. So using things that you can deal with in the laboratory, in your house, to talk about the larger world. And now there's this natural history method of the Baconians. Go out, make observations, and then draw your conclusions slowly from those. The interesting thing is that all of these coexisted in the scientific revolution. It was this great marketplace of ideas and methodologies. It must have been a very exciting time. And all these characters, the ones we've seen already, the ones we're going to see, use these methods, adopt these methods, they hybridize them, they use some for one thing, they use another method for something else, they make their own systems. Very, very interesting. I should say that this also makes it difficult for historians of science to study the scientific revolution, because there are all these people, all these camps doing different kinds of things. And so the story is really very, very complex. In a sense, historians of science today find them in a place not unlike the natural historians of the late 16th century, who have this information overload. We're getting all this information from new worlds and new areas of interest that historians of science are working on, and we're not quite sure right at the moment how it all fits together, how to explain this period of very important change, very important development in Western culture. So it's an ongoing process still, but a very exciting one. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to look at yet one more way of conceptualizing and explaining the world. A view, a curious view perhaps, that tells us that we're all living in an immense clockwork.